"Daddy is not dead. He's under the floorboards," said the black girl. Then the police started digging. "Daddy's not dead," Kesha whispered, her small voice cutting through the sterile silence of the police station. "He's under the floorboards." Detective Thompson froze, his hand stilling mid-motion as he reached for his coffee. The words hung in the air, sharp and jarring. Kesha sat in the chair, legs swinging, clutching her worn teddy bear like it was her last piece of safety. Her eyes, dark and serious, were focused ahead, unblinking. She didn't seem like a child making up a story, as children often do. No. Kesha's words were delivered with the eerie calmness of someone who had witnessed something they shouldn't have. Vanessa Johnson, Marcus's wife, sat across from them, her composure unnerving. She adjusted her designer handbag, a slight tilt of her head as if the child's words were beneath her notice. "Kids say the strangest things," she said with a casual shrug, her tone dismissive. She had the kind of voice that suggested she'd never had to explain herself to anyone. A voice born from years of privilege and entitlement. Thompson's gaze shifted from Vanessa to Kesha. He caught her eyes, dark and impossibly knowing for a girl of 5. There was no innocence in those eyes, no childish imagination, no glint of fantasy. Just cold, unsettling certainty. He swallowed the rising lump in his throat. He exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance with Sergeant Davis. His partner, who had been tapping his pen absently, stilled. Davis's face had changed, his previous indifference replaced with a flicker of concern. Thompson could see it in his partner's eyes. This wasn't just a child's game. This was real. Kesha repeated, more firmly this time. "He's down there, where Mommy put the new tiles." The room seemed to shrink as the words settled into the space between them. There was a moment of collective disbelief, thick with the weight of what they were hearing. Detective Thompson shifted in his seat, his mind racing, the logical side of him trying to suppress the unsettling feeling that Kesha might just be telling the truth. He glanced at Vanessa, her polished exterior unbothered by the child's chilling statement, but Thompson could see the faintest tremor in her hand as she reached for her glass of water. There was something in Kesha's eyes that wasn't right, something that shouldn't be there for a girl so young. And it was beginning to gnaw at him. Something was about to shift in this case, something deep and dangerous, and Thompson could feel it crawling under his skin. "We'll look into it," Thompson said, his voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil twisting in his gut. The air in the house was thick with unease as Detective Thompson and Sergeant Davis stood at the threshold of the Johnson residence. It was a quiet, upscale suburban neighborhood, where the houses were pristine and meticulously kept. Yet today this place felt different, colder somehow. As they stepped inside, the familiar scent of polished wood and fresh paint couldn't mask the tension that permeated every corner of the house. The sense of dread that had begun in the station now hung heavily in the air, weighing on Thompson's chest. They moved toward the kitchen, the center of Kesha's unsettling statement. Thompson examined the area carefully, his eyes narrowing as they scanned the freshly laid tiles on the floor. The renovations were clearly new, done hastily, almost too quickly. The grout between the tiles was uneven, and there were faint signs of recent disturbance around the edges of the floor. No one would have thought twice about it except for the context, and the child's chilling words. "Daddy is under the floorboards." Thompson's gaze shifted to Vanessa, who stood silently by the counter, arms crossed. Her presence was unsettling in its cold detachment. Where was the grief, the concern for a missing husband? Instead, there was only a poised indifference, as though this whole ordeal were a mere inconvenience for her. Her lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes were distant, unfocused. It was as though she had already moved on, prepared to continue her life without Marcus. The contrast between Marcus and Vanessa was stark. Marcus, a respected civil engineer, a man well-liked by his colleagues and community, had always been known for his punctuality, his commitment to his daughter, and his devotion to his work. He wasn't the type to disappear without a word, let alone leave his daughter behind without a second thought. Yet, here they were, looking at the remnants of his life, now overshadowed by an inexplicable absence. Thompson tried to push the nagging thought aside, that something wasn't right. His mind began to piece together fragments. Like a jigsaw puzzle he wasn't ready to solve yet. Why had the renovations been done so quickly? Why had Vanessa so casually dismissed the disappearance? Where was the urgency? The worry? The silence in the room grew suffocating as Thompson's thoughts swirled, each unanswered question adding weight to his growing unease. Davis, who had been silently observing the scene, stepped forward, his expression tight. She doesn't even seem concerned, does she? Thompson didn't answer right away. He was too busy cataloging the small, subtle details in the house, the ones that didn't add up. A slight shift in a chair, a worn-out spot on the rug, the way the kitchen cabinets were organized. It all felt like a performance. A performance for who? As he stared at Vanessa's unbothered demeanor, the feeling of something terribly wrong grew sharper. What was she hiding? And why did it feel like she was the only one not desperate to find Marcus? The weight of her calmness, the coldness in her eyes, was more unsettling than any scream of terror could ever be. Something was slipping through his fingers. Something big, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to confront it. But he had no choice. Thompson took one last look at the kitchen before slowly turning to face Vanessa. The room held its breath. Thompson sat across from Vanessa, his fingers steepled in front of him as he observed her. She was calm, too calm, as if the stakes of the situation hadn't yet sunk in. Her posture was perfect, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but her eyes, those cold eyes, betrayed nothing. She was a picture of composure, an image of detachment so complete that it felt almost deliberate. Yet Thompson wasn't fooled. Not anymore. His mind lingered on Kesha's words. Daddy's under the floorboards. The simple, unsettling clarity in the girl's voice haunted him. It echoed in the back of his mind, louder now than the steady hum of the office air conditioning. Could a child be so detailed in her imaginings? Could her story be so vivid without the shadow of truth behind it? He wasn't sure, but he wasn't about to dismiss it. Not yet. Thompson's thoughts were still, like the calm before a storm. The rest of the world outside this room felt distant, muffled. Everything was in slow motion, and yet his heart beat with the quiet intensity of a predator watching from the shadows. He didn't speak much. His lips pressed thin, barely a flicker of emotion betraying the calm facade he wore so well. Beneath the surface, however, a storm of thoughts churned inside him. Questions, possibilities, doubts, but he held them in check. The quiet rhythm of Vanessa's breath, the way her fingers tapped impatiently against the armrest, was like an invitation to pry deeper. Her tone, so dismissive of the child's story, spoke volumes. She believed she could control the narrative, direct the investigation, keep her hands clean. But Thompson saw through it, saw the lie that lingered in her every gesture. He could hear the mockery in the back of his mind. At the station, others had dismissed Kesha's statement as just that. A child's fantasy, nothing more. They'd laughed it off. Sergeant Davis, too, had rolled his eyes when the little girl's claims were first relayed. But Thompson's eyes never wavered. He could hear the laughter, but his gaze remained fixed on Vanessa, piercing, calculating. He didn't react. Not yet. The detective's resolve solidified like cement setting in place. Something was deeply wrong with this case. The lies had already begun to form, but they would not be allowed to stand. He would uncover the truth, slowly, methodically. The quiet confidence within him told him everything he needed to know. Kesha had spoken the truth. And Vanessa? She was about to slip. Thompson exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with the promise of what was to come. Something was buried here, and he was going to find it, no matter how long it took. Thompson's calm voice broke the silence, but his words cut through the tension in the room like a knife. I'd like to take a closer look at the kitchen, if you don't mind. Need a few tools to examine the floor. Vanessa didn't respond immediately. She didn't have to. Her unspoken consent was clear in the dismissive wave of her hand. It was almost as though she expected Thompson's inquiry, perhaps even hoped he'd make it. She had already prepared for this, hadn't she? The detective was a minor inconvenience, someone she could easily handle. He was just another cop chasing down a missing husband. But Thompson wasn't just another cop. Not this time. With a slow, deliberate motion, he stood up and approached the kitchen. His movements were precise, as though every step had been planned, calculated. He gave Vanessa a polite smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thompson didn't need her approval. He wasn't there for her. He was there to find the truth, and he had no intention of letting anything, or anyone, stand in his way. The crowd that had gathered in the hallway, previously indifferent, now watched intently. Thompson could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he surveyed the kitchen with an unhurried gaze, letting his eyes linger on the freshly laid tiles, the subtle cracks, the places where the grout was too perfect, the details that didn't belong. He crouched down near the floorboards and began to examine them carefully. The click of his tools was the only sound in the room. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sharp focus of the detective's mind and his careful, deliberate movements. As Thompson worked, a quiet voice interrupted his concentration. "I heard something the night Marcus disappeared." Thompson turned to find Mrs. Williams, a neighbor who had been silently observing the scene, now stepping forward. She was an older woman, her posture stooped slightly with age, but her eyes were sharp. She was watching him closely, her words laced with a quiet urgency. "What did you hear?" Thompson asked, keeping his tone neutral but his attention fixed on her. She lowered her voice, glancing nervously toward Vanessa, who was still watching him from across the room. "The night Marcus vanished, strange noises. Sounds like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." Her voice trailed off, her eyes darting back to the kitchen, her anxiety palpable. Thompson nodded slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, though it was hidden by his calm exterior. This was the first crack in the case. He hadn't been wrong. Turning back to the floor, he pressed a little harder, feeling the unevenness in the boards beneath his fingers. The weight of Mrs. Williams' words lingered in his mind. Strange noises, dragging something heavy. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Vanessa's calm facade was beginning to crack, and Thompson's confidence swelled. This was the moment the power dynamics began to shift. Thompson didn't need to rush. He knew the truth was coming to the surface. Slowly, steadily, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. And soon, Vanessa would have nowhere to hide. As Thompson worked, the laughter from the hallway outside grew louder. It was a quiet mockery, the kind that came from people who had already decided that this was just another waste of time. They didn't know what he was doing, didn't understand why he was so focused on the kitchen floor. But Thompson wasn't bothered by their laughter. His eyes were steady as he worked, methodical, precise, each movement a testament to his skill. He handled his tools like a master craftsman, making adjustments here, measuring with quiet attention there. He wasn't in a rush, there was no need. The truth would come to him in its own time. The crowd's laughter, muffled from behind the closed door, seemed almost to fade as Thompson pressed on. He didn't react to it, he didn't need to. His focus was absolute. Each scrape of the floorboard, each small adjustment was part of a larger plan. In the midst of their scorn, he was moving forward with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Then a faint hum. It was barely audible at first, a soft vibration from beneath the floor. Thompson paused, his fingers stilling on the board. The sound was like a whisper in the quiet room, but it was enough to send a wave of excitement through him. He carefully pressed again, coaxing the floor to give way. Slowly, inch by inch, the hidden mechanism revealed itself. The crowd outside had stopped laughing. The sound of Thompson's steady work had turned into something more. A whisper of success, a sign of progress. The hum grew louder, clearer, as the boards shifted. There was something beneath them, something that shouldn't be there. The crowd's mood shifted too, from laughter to unease, from mockery to curiosity. They were no longer laughing. They were watching. Thompson's calm remained unchanged, his face expressionless as he uncovered the hidden clues. The pieces were falling into place, and he knew this was the moment when everything would change. He wasn't the fool they thought him to be. With each subtle shift in the floor, with each piece of evidence revealed, he could feel the power of the situation shift in his favor. The hum grew louder, more pronounced, a signal, a breakthrough. The sound echoed through the kitchen, breaking the silence that had surrounded them all. And in that moment, the detective's competence became undeniable. No longer dismissed as an amateur or a fool, Thompson had begun to uncover the truth. And now, the crowd was watching, silent and uneasy. The game had changed. Thompson's fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the newly uncovered section of the floorboard. The subtle shift in the tiles was almost imperceptible, but to him it was unmistakable. He pressed down gently, and with a soft crack, the floorboards gave way, revealing a hidden trapdoor beneath the newly laid tiles. The hum from earlier grew louder, now unmistakably resonating through the air as the trapdoor creaked open. A gasp rippled through the room. The laughter that had once echoed from the hallway was now replaced by an oppressive silence. The people gathered outside, who had once scoffed and mocked, now stood frozen in place, their eyes wide with disbelief. The truth, buried just below the surface, was starting to reveal itself. Vanessa, her face pale, stepped forward, a flicker of panic crossing her features. Her usual composure was slipping, her voice unsteady as she tried to dismiss the discovery. "It's nothing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, attempting to cover the raw edge of fear creeping into her tone. "A coincidence. Just a mistake. It's nothing to get excited about." But Thompson didn't flinch. His steady gaze locked onto hers, his demeanor unchanged. He stood up, the trapdoor now fully exposed. "It's not a coincidence," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the silence. "The noises Kesha heard, the ones she described with such detail, they were real. You can't dismiss that." The crowd, once mocking and incredulous, now stood frozen, eyes shifting between Thompson and the trapdoor. The weight of his words sank in, and the mockery they had thrown at him earlier began to turn into unease. The power dynamic in the room had shifted in an instant. Vanessa, visibly struggling to maintain her composure, tried again to deflect. "This doesn't mean anything," she repeated, her voice more frantic now. "It's just a small renovation. I had to get the floors done for the house. This is ridiculous." Thompson, unfazed, walked slowly toward the trapdoor and knelt down, examining it with quiet precision. He gently lifted the edges, revealing the hidden space beneath. The faint, familiar scent of earth and dust filled the room. The reality of what they had uncovered, what Kesha had so bluntly described, was now undeniable. The trapdoor was real. The noises were real. "Funny," Thompson said, his voice even, "how everything you've set up until now has been a lie." He turned to face the crowd, his calm, controlled demeanor a sharp contrast to the desperation creeping into Vanessa's voice. "The pieces are falling into place. It's only a matter of time before everything comes to light." The crowd that had once mocked Thompson now stood in silent awe, their earlier judgment of him replaced with unease. Some exchanged nervous glances. Others took a step back as the weight of the situation settled in. The balance of power had completely shifted. The quiet detective had become the force driving the truth forward. Vanessa was now backed into a corner, her earlier confidence replaced by visible fear. She could no longer deny the reality unfolding before her. The room, once filled with derision and disbelief, was now charged with the anticipation of the truth being uncovered. Thompson had made his move, and the lies were beginning to unravel. The room, heavy with anticipation, seemed to hold its breath as Thompson stood by the trapdoor, the truth finally on the edge of being exposed. But just as the tension reached its peak, the door creaked open, and someone stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway. A figure, older, more composed, with a presence that seemed to fill the room. Thompson's father, Richard Thompson, a renowned engineer whose work had shaped the foundations of modern construction. He was a man whose reputation had been built on decades of expertise, whose knowledge of mechanics and structural integrity was unmatched. The crowd fell silent as the older Thompson entered the room. His eyes immediately found Thompson's, a silent communication passing between them, a wordless understanding that what was about to unfold would change everything. "I believe this is where I come in," Richard said, his voice low but confident, carrying the weight of years spent in the world of structural design and engineering. His gaze flicked toward Vanessa, then to the trapdoor and finally to the crowd, who were still reeling from the turn of events. Thompson remained calm, his face impassive as his father spoke. There was no excitement in the older man's voice, no sense of triumph, just quiet certainty. Richard approached the trapdoor with measured steps, his hands steady as he examined the exposed floorboards. "I've been helping my son," Richard continued, his words deliberate. "This isn't a coincidence. The knowledge you see here, the quiet confidence, it's not just luck. It's years of expertise." He bent down, tapping a specific spot on the floor, his fingers tracing the exact place where the boards had shifted. "This particular technique is one I've used many times before in my career. Simple yet effective. And as you can see, it works." The crowd, already stunned by the reveal of the hidden floor, now stood in disbelief as the true depth of Thompson's ability came into focus. His calm demeanor, which had once seemed like nothing more than a mask of detachment, was now understood. It wasn't apathy, it wasn't indifference. It was the quiet assurance that comes from years of mastery, the kind of deep, unshakable confidence that only comes with true understanding. Vanessa, still reeling from the unfolding events, stared in shock. The detective she had dismissed as a mere pawn in her game was, in fact, the product of something much greater, a legacy of intellect and experience. The crowd, once skeptical and mocking, now watched with wide eyes as the full truth began to emerge. Thompson's calmness wasn't just an act. It was the result of a lineage of wisdom, and now, with his father's revelation, the puzzle was complete. Vanessa's earlier deflections, her attempts to control the situation, seemed nothing more than feeble attempts to hold back a tide that had already begun to sweep over her. Thompson's identity, built on years of hidden genius and a legacy of quiet mastery, had been unveiled. And with that, the truth, the full truth, was now inescapable. The room seemed to grow colder as Thompson stood tall, a stack of papers in his hand, his gaze unwavering. The silence was palpable, hanging heavily as he began to lay out the evidence that had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. With a deliberate motion, Thompson slid the first piece of evidence across the table, a phone record. The crowd leaned forward, their attention suddenly riveted to the document as he held it up for all to see. Marcus Johnson's last phone call was placed well after his supposed disappearance, Thompson announced, his voice calm but firm. He let the weight of the words sink in. This call was made at 11:45 p.m., several hours after Vanessa claimed he was gone. A simple call to his lawyer. "And here's the kicker," he added, his tone now cutting through the tension. "He was still alive when he made it." Vanessa's face drained of color as she glanced nervously around the room. Her eyes flickered, betraying her panic as she tried to recover, to redirect the attention. But Thompson was already a step ahead. He continued, his voice unwavering, "In addition to that, I've uncovered a series of transactions. Wire transfers to a shell cryptocurrency account in her name, transferred out of Marcus' joint account. And these aren't just small amounts. We're talking thousands of dollars. Money siphoned off in the days leading up to Marcus' disappearance." The crowd, once divided, now stood still, their judgment silent but unmistakable. They had seen enough. The facade that Vanessa had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling before them. Her lies, once so easily accepted, were now exposed for what they truly were, a web of manipulation and deceit. Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. She fumbled for an excuse, but Thompson's calm, steady voice drowned out her stammering. "You see," he continued, "this wasn't just a case of a missing husband. This was a calculated decision, a plan to eliminate Marcus and take everything he had. Vanessa's back straightened for a moment, her face hardening, but the truth was now too clear. The walls were closing in. There was no escape from the truth. She was isolated now, and the room felt smaller with each passing second. The crowd that had once been skeptical now watched her with cold, silent judgment. Her lies had caught up with her, and there was no longer any denying it. The trap she had so carefully laid for her husband was now the one trapping her, and the consequences loomed large on the horizon. Legal action would follow, and with it, the full weight of the law. The collapse of Vanessa's false facade was complete. There was no mask left to wear, no story to spin. She had been exposed, and the reality of her situation was clear. As the room turned its gaze upon her, the silent judgment was deafening. She was done. Several days passed, and the wheels of justice turned relentlessly. Vanessa was arrested. The life she had so carefully constructed around lies and manipulation began to crumble. Her arrest was swift, the evidence undeniable, and soon her name was all over the news, painted in the starkest colors of scandal and betrayal. The legal consequences were in motion, her future now sealed by the truths that Thompson had patiently uncovered. For the crowd that had once mocked him, their judgment had been met with an undeniable vindication. The case had been solved, the lies exposed, and the guilty party brought to justice. The shift in power, once so gradual, had culminated in a final, irreversible fall. But for Thompson, the triumph was quieter, more personal, and infinitely more complex. As the days passed, his mind often returned to Kesha, to the small girl whose innocence and courage had sparked the unraveling of the truth. Kesha was now recovering, her bright eyes free of the weight they had once carried. She was in the care of Mrs. Williams, a kind neighbor who had taken her in as her new guardian. Thompson had been deeply moved by the quiet resilience of the child. She had witnessed a horror no child should ever know, and yet, with the purity of her heart, she had shown them the way. He thought about the day he had spent with Kesha at the graveyard, standing by the small, simple gravestone that marked Marcus Johnson's resting place. Kesha had placed yellow flowers, her father's favorite, gently on the stone. Her small hands trembled only slightly, but her resolve was unshakable. She had done something no adult could have. She had spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had given her father the justice he deserved. Standing at the grave, Kesha had turned to him with a soft smile. "I helped Daddy not be forgotten, right?" she had asked, her voice full of quiet wisdom. In that moment, Thompson realized the true power of what had happened. The smallest of warriors had brought about the greatest of victories. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest warriors, Thompson whispered to himself as he stood there, watching Kesha. He knew that she had already done more for justice than most people would ever accomplish in a lifetime. The case had taken its toll on him, emotionally and mentally, but in the quiet moments of reflection, as he watched Kesha thrive, he found solace in the understanding that sometimes the true strength of a hero lies not in confrontation, but in their patience, their calm, and their unwavering commitment to truth. Thompson had learned that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the light of innocence, and the truth that follows it, would always find its way through. The final page had turned. Justice had been served, and Thompson had been reminded of the enduring power of truth, even when it comes from the unlikeliest of places.